Now we're going to start talking about types of connective tissue. In my previous video, I discussed the cells that make up connective tissue. And before that, I talked about the fibers that make up connective tissue. One thing I want to remind you of before I get into the types here is that connective tissue cells do not touch each other. So there's a space between. There's a lot of weird examples you could think of, but if you think of like when you eat a bowl of cereal, right? I got a bowl of Oreos. Those Oreos would be the cells. The milk between the Oreos would be the extracellular matrix, the area between the cells. So if I have blood, the blood cells are the Oreos. The plasma would be the milk. All right. So kind of weird reference there, but think of that as we go through these things. So types of connective tissue. The first type we're going to talk about, the first three or four are going to be kind of hard to grasp because can't really see them. All right. And then we'll get into things that you've probably heard of before. So the first type is called loose or areolar connective tissue. You can see a picture there on the right. These things they're going to have like a gel-like extracellular matrix. That's that area between the cells. I'm going to say that a lot. Okay, so this gel-like, so this is like a stretchable connective tissue. Where you're going to see these things between different structures holding them together. The biggest part where we see this is it basically binds our skin to everything underneath of it. Okay, so this areolar or loose connective tissue, and we're going to talk about this more later in the year when we get to the integumentary system. But it basically binds our skin to everything underneath. See, there's fibroblasts in it. It does have some elastic fibers and collagen fibers, so it's kind of made up of a mix of different types of fibers on this interwoven, able to be stretched arrangement. So that's loose. Again, nothing too exciting there. Next type is called adipose tissue. Adipose is fat. This is one you probably have heard of before. Obviously, we talked about this. People carry a lot of adipose tissue. Remember, we said they were endomorphs. Well, that's because they have these things called adipocytes. Everybody has adipocytes, but they may carry more fat in those adipocytes. Okay, so adipose tissue is fat tissue. It does a lot for us. First of all, everybody needs fat, so don't be afraid to say, "Okay, I got some fat on my body." Provides insulation. It protects our internal organs. It allows us to store excess energy. So it really does a lot of stuff. Fat does a lot of stuff for us. Main thing is it's made up of these things called adipocytes, and you can see a picture there. Here's the difference between an adipocyte and any other type of cell, okay, fat tissue cell. These things can grow. The reason they can grow is they will accumulate fat. So if you eat a lot of fatty foods, well, sometimes that fat will get sent to these adipocytes, and they'll actually get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. If they get too big, if somebody stores too much fat, it starts to crowd out other tissues or other structures in the body. And that's when you'll start to see fat accumulating on somebody. So let's say you have, a bodybuilder. And a bodybuilder has very low percentage of body fat. That's because their adipocytes basically are not storing any of that fat. So everybody has pretty much the same amount of adipocytes. It's basically just how much fat is stored in those adipocytes that is causing them to look bigger. Now, if that bodybuilder stops lifting, they stop working out, they go to McDonald's every day, those adipocytes will grow and grow because you can see here that fat reservoir inside of them will grow. Storage for excess food and insulation. If you remember from biology, we talked about how lipids allow us to store excess energy. So we can store excess energy in our fat. If you've ever heard of somebody doing a low carb diet, if you do a low carb diet, you are cutting out your carbohydrates that you use for energy. So what does our body do? It starts to go borrow that energy from our fat cells. And that's why people lose weight pretty quickly, because we're burning that fat that's stored in our adipocytes. And then you can see there where you would find them: abdomen, spaces between our muscles, beneath the skin, We have fat on the surface of our heart. You get to hear the announcements here. I apologize for that. I'm just going to keep rolling. Okay. Cushion joints, stores energy. Our next type is reticular tissue. Reticular. Again, this one's not too exciting. Probably one that you might not have heard of before, but a 3D web. Now, here's what's cool about this reticular tissue. It basically is a filter. Okay. And this filter, think of a coffee filter. Coffee filter allows the water to go through, but holds the coffee grounds and the coffee beans inside of it. Well, this reticular tissue, it's found a lot in our lymphatic system and our bone marrow, basically filters out the stuff that might cause us harm. We call them microorganisms or pathogens. All right. So it filters all that stuff out of our blood and tries to protect us and defend us against infection. So a big part of the spleen and your lymph nodes, if you've ever had a swollen lymph nodes because of an infection, that lymph node has basically filtered out that infection and it's infected. Okay, so these things do a big job in keeping us healthy by filtering out injurious substances. Then we have dense fibrous tissue. There's two types of dense fibrous tissue I want to discuss here. The first one is called the regular dense fibrous. That's this one right here. Okay, the regular dense fibrous is made of these really thick collagen fibers in parallel rows. Now, if you've ever heard of a tendon connects your muscles to your bone, or a ligament, which connect your bones to other bones at joints. Okay, those are made of regular dense connective tissue. Now, the thing about these are they're super strong, but they really are only meant to bend or stretch in a limited direction. Okay, so if you've seen somebody tear their ACL, it's basically because their knee went the wrong way, right? And the ACL, by the way, is a ligament in the knee. It's because these regular dense connective tissues, which tendons and ligaments, aren't made to bend every direction. So when they're bent the wrong way, they get torn. But they are really strong. Our other type is called irregular dense. Irregular dense is basically all these fibers that are kind of interwoven and go in a bunch of different directions. They're not in these nice, neat parallel rows. Okay. Really, really strong. It can basically stretch in any direction you pull it. Okay. We have this layer underneath so our outer layer of skin is called the epidermis. Underneath the epidermis is the dermis. The dermis, if you were to take your skin, which I wouldn't recommend it, and pull it and push it and twist it and do all kinds of things with your skin, it can withstand a lot of force. Okay. Well, that's because underneath your outer layer of skin, you have this dermis, which is irregular dense connective tissue, which can withstand force in many, many directions because of how the fibers are arranged, which are kind of intertwined in many different directions. Elastic connective tissue. Elastic, this is another one of those boring ones. There's not a whole lot of cool things to tell you about this, but we have these elastic fibers that are in parallel rows, but remember that elastic fibers are not quite as strong as our collagenous fibers. Okay. So they are stretchable. Okay. They can stretch and they'll return to their original shape, but we don't want these things basically withstanding a ton of force, maybe like a ligament or a tendon would. Okay. And you could see where we would find them. So like in our respiratory tract, parts of our heart, our vocal cords are made of elastic connective tissue. They can stretch, but they are a little bit more delicate than those large collagenous fibers that would be making our ligaments and tendons. Okay. All those types that I just told you, if I could go back here, I had dense fibrous, I had reticular, I had adipose, and I had areolar. Those are all types of fibrous connective tissues, kind of in the same class. got to get into some new ones on our next video. We'll start with bone, but I'm not going to do that here because this video has already been too long with an odd interruption from Mr. Jagger.